Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go Young Professionals Edition, Washington Policy Center's podcast of news, interviews, and policy analysis featuring our young professionals.
Hello, my name is Michael Eisenberg. I'm a member of the Washington Policy Center Young Professionals, and I'm on the Young Professionals Marketing Committee. Today we're going to be talking about housing issues in Washington State and housing-related bills from the last legislative session. Here with me today is Senator Hans Zeiger from Puyallup, representing District 25. He serves as ranking member on two Senate committees, the Housing Stability and Affordability Committee and the State Government, Tribal Relations, and Elections Committee. He's also a member of the Transportation Committee and the Human Services, Reentry, and Rehabilitation Committee. Senator Zeiger, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So I guess just to start, what would you say are some of the most important housing issues that we're currently facing in Washington State?
Well, there are a growing number of housing issues given all that's going on with COVID-19, as there are a growing number of economic issues in general. But we were facing some housing challenges in this state prior to COVID-19, even in the midst of a good economy. One of the challenges was that we had fallen far short of the demand for housing in our state. There was an Up for Growth study that came out early this year that said that we are 225,000 units short of housing that should have been constructed between 2000 and 2015. And so we have to figure out ways to catch up. Now, the good news is that the legislature is paying attention to this. And in the last couple of years, we have spent more time on housing related issues than we have at any time during my decade in the legislature. And so legislators are paying attention. There's some good ideas as well as some bad ideas out there about what to do. But I think a broad recognition that we have a supply issue, a housing supply issue. There are some misdirected, misguided, I think, ways of responding to that issue. Some would say, for instance, when it comes to the rental market and some of the pressures that are coming down on the rental market, that we need to regulate our way out of that, regulate landlords. And there may be some limited way that that's appropriate, but by and large, again, we have a supply issue. We're not going to regulate our way out of that. We've got to increase supply. As you have more supply, prices can come down, rents can come down. And one of the challenges we're facing right now in the COVID-19 crisis, as it relates to the rental market, is that while it's perfectly understandable that the governor would have applied a moratorium on evictions in the rental market, it's also become a real challenge, particularly for mom and pop landlords, when they're not getting rent payments. And so that then increases pressure on government to come up with some kind of financial remedy to that problem. And I'm afraid that government just does not have the resources at hand to solve all of the kinds of financial pressures that are going to be coming out of this. So it's a very difficult situation. But my hope is that as we move into the recovery phase, that we would see this as an opportunity to not only get back on track with meeting that demand for new housing units in our state, but that we would see this as an opportunity to create new incentives in the construction industry to stimulate that part of our economy that was shut down for a period of time, and that we would see this as an opportunity to increase housing supply in our state.
Now, in order to increase the housing supply, do you think we should increase rezoning in order to do that? And if so, how do you win in a struggle against people with the not in my backyard attitudes regarding rezoning?
Yeah, there are good arguments to be made that we need to do that at the local level, and there are some who say we need to do that at the state, that we need to basically come in as a state and make kind of mandate what locals need to do in order to meet some of the challenges we face. I tend to say let's respect the role for local government. That can be messy at times. It can be hard. Those are hard conversations to have about housing, but they're happening, and in many cases they're being successful because people understand the pressures that we're facing as a region, and that if we grow economically, we can grow together. And so, again, I think these decisions do need to be made locally, but the state can have a role in incentivizing growth, and it can also have a role in creating new options. I worked on legislation last year related to tiny houses, which are, I think, that's a market waiting to take off. There is a certain segment of our economy that would really welcome the opportunity to live in a tiny house, but we really didn't have a way for most local jurisdictions shied away from that kind of activity. And I think because of legislation we passed last year, I think we're going to start seeing more tiny house activity across Washington State.
And you mentioned that, how much the more of a focus the legislature is having on housing-related issues. You introduced a number of housing-related bills in the Senate this past legislative session. Senate Bill 6546, incentivizing shared housing. Senate Bill 6630, increasing accountability for public housing authorities. Senate Bill 6647, regarding Department of Commerce data on homeless claims. And Senate Bill 6649, establishing a local sales and use tax option to fund emergency homeless shelters. Could you give us a brief summary on each of those?
So I think I'll take a couple of the issues there and make some distinctions. There's the housing issue, and that ties in some ways to homelessness, but there are other issues that are encompassed within that broad topic of homelessness. So I think it's important to make some distinctions there. When it comes to accountability for housing authorities, one of the things that came up last year was here in Pierce County, where I am, the Pierce County Housing Authority. There was a situation where a high-ranking official within the housing authority or staff member was basically siphoning money off public dollars, and that was uncovered in a state audit. And so there was some effort. Okay, we need to make sure that we're doing a better job of doing auditing to uncover any kind of misdoing in public housing authorities and to have that level of accountability that's needed. We also need to do a better job of tracking spending, specifically when it comes to homelessness, and making sure that the public has means of accountability for that kind of spending, because we are spending a lot of money on homelessness. As of this past legislative session in the supplemental budget, well over $700 million that can be spent on housing or homelessness related programs, both in the operating and the capital budget of our state. So it's not for lack of trying. We are spending a lot of money at the state level, not to mention the local dollars and the federal dollars and the private dollars that are going in to tackle that challenge. And I would argue that to effectively address homelessness, we do have to address the issues of housing insecurity that people face in a market where there are too few housing options, and in a situation that is housing insecurity that is exacerbated by the economic pressures we're feeling in the COVID-19 era. But we also have to address the issues of substance use disorder and mental illness that so many people in our society are facing today. So many families and communities are dealing with the effects of that. We have to address that because there is a strong linkage, particularly between folks who are dealing with substance use disorder and mental illness and those who are living on the street. We have to address those who are specifically unhoused and living on the streets. And there are, solutions there that have to do to really effectively deal with that population. I think we have to keep the goal of self-sufficiency in mind. It's easy to come up with kind of magic bullet solutions when it comes to that population, but we have to think person by person by person when it comes to our street homelessness population. And finally, we have to address homelessness as an issue of safety, an issue of public safety for business owners who are impacted by it, an issue of safety for those who are living on the streets. And we have to get after things like the drug supply chain that are contributing to people becoming addicted, people ending up on the streets and in a cycle of poverty. And so it's a multi-front kind of an issue, and we have to address it that way.
Thank you, Senator. There are a number of bills that you voted on which passed the Senate with strong majorities, and I was just curious if there's any of those bills that you're particularly glad to have helped pass.
Well, there is good bipartisan collaboration on some of the housing and homelessness related issues. One of the issues that I was glad to see, one of the bills I was glad to see passed last year that I thought represented some good bipartisan work as well as coalition building work where interests that don't always work together came together and found a compromise solution, was House Bill 1923. And getting back to what you were asking about earlier about about density planning in urban areas within cities, infill, those kinds of things. Those are very difficult, very hard conversations at the local level. But I thought we came up with a very responsible package of incentives to encourage density planning actions without mandating that. That was led by Representative Joe Fitzgibbon in the House, and everybody from cities to realtors to environmental interests were at the table coming up with a compromise on that. There was follow-up legislation of that this year. Again, I think a lot of good stakeholder work went into that, and that's where our process works. Where you have folks coming together, a lot of different varied interests at the table, saying, okay, we can work something out here, and I think that is a powerful incentive. And we have to think more in terms of incentives and thinking in terms of options as opposed to mandates or as opposed to subsidies, because I think a lot of people think, well, we've got all these affordable housing challenges in our state. Why don't we just subsidize that by government? Government just cannot subsidize our way out of this challenge. Ultimately, the market has to be set free to do that.
And in order to find, the cost of housing varies a lot by location. So sometimes to find affordable housing, you have to look a bit further away, but that'll require commuting longer distances. And that then gets into the entire area issue of transportation and congestion in the area. Are there ways you think we could reduce congestion so that people would have an easier time of finding a place to live and buying into the housing market?
Yeah. Well, we've got to continue to make investments at the state level in transportation, no question about that. But I think one of the lessons we're really learning from this time period in our history is just that some of the ways that we have worked, some of the habits that we have of going to work, maybe are worth revisiting. And I think a lot of companies are discovering for the first time that maybe telecommuting is worth doing. Maybe that's something that they can sustain, and that, maybe not everybody all the time, but that there's some sense in doing that at least part of the time. And that takes congestion off of our roadways, gives people higher quality of life, gives people more choice in how they do their work. That's something particularly that younger workers value, is some flexibility in their work schedule. But I think that companies are finding that there's some benefit to that as well. And so just, that is a category of discussion that we just have not had like we should in the legislative process. And so I think we need to start thinking about how do we incentivize that, because there's societal good that comes from that, not only good to the employers and good to the employees, but there's good for our state, congestion relief, pollution reduction, and so forth. So let's think about that as a public policy issue going forward.
Is the Congress considering future housing legislation as a direct result of COVID-19? Obviously, it's on everybody's mind, and there's been a wide variety of legislation due to COVID-19. But would you say, is there anything planned that's housing specific in the future?
Well, Congressman Denny Heck at the federal level from Washington State is working on legislation to provide rental assistance for that rental market that we were talking about, to help with just the many pressures that have come to bear there, where people can't afford to pay their rent, where you have mom and pop landlords are struggling to pay their mortgages as a result of that. There's all these secondary and third effects from everything going on. So that's at the federal level. At the state level, I will tell you that I think people in my party and the Republican Party have got to be the voice of restraint right now, because there are going to be there are going to be endless demands for funding in any category of economic activity to mitigate the effects of everything that has happened. And we're going to have such a decline in state revenues coming out of this that we have got to really restrain ourselves at this point. But also that's an opportunity for us to rethink some of our priorities. I think some of the things that maybe we didn't have as high of a priority before, such as public health, I think will be elevated. But a number of other areas of government spending are just going to have to be cut or at the very least maintained. And this coming after several years of revenue growth in Washington State, where we've gotten used to increased budget after increased budget. And that's just not going to be the case going forward. Now, we do have a big infusion of federal money coming our way, and that'll be helpful, but it's not going to be everything, and it's not going to last forever. And so we're going to have to get used to restraint. And I think that's probably going to have to last for a little while. It's not going to be just sort of something that's over and done with.
I think probably one of the hardest things for government at all levels is to require self-discipline when it comes to spending and debt management. There are two housing bills in this past session that you voted against, both of which passed. House Bill 1590 authorized a county legislative authority to impose local sales and use tax. And Senate Bill 6617 was with regards to regulations about accessory dwelling units. Could you tell us why you voted against those bills? What you feel about them?
Yeah, my recollection on those bills is the one creating a new tax. I'm hesitant to create new taxes. And I think there are times where local options make some sense, but the legislature should act cautiously in that regard. And I think the message that we've been hearing from a lot, certainly the constituents who I represent, is that we need to be cautious about new taxes. When it comes to accessory dwelling units, I mentioned the tiny house legislation I worked on last year. I'm also interested in expanding the presence of accessory dwelling units. But again, I think we can do that through incentives. And there was legislation this past legislative session that would have mandated a certain presence of accessory dwelling units as well as other kinds of housing. I'm uncomfortable with mandates, uncomfortable with telling local people what they have to do. I think it's more important for local people to have that buy-in, give people options, and let them make choices at that local level. I'm interested in our local governments being stronger and being capable of engaging their local citizens in these conversations about, how do we solve our housing challenges? And cities have proven all the time that they are capable of doing that. But those are difficult conversations. I would rather have that happen than at the state level, where we don't know collectively as a legislature each and every neighborhood in the state. And so it's important to leave those decisions to the local level.
It's always best to have the problem solved the solutions generated as close to the problem as possible.
Exactly.
That way on all levels. Returning to COVID-19 for a moment, residential construction was initially considered a non-essential service under the stay-at-home orders that came in the end of March. And then I believe Governor Inslee announced a plan near the end of April to allow residential construction to resume, but under certain restrictions. Could you explain what those restrictions are, and are they reasonable, or will they be impossible for residential construction to implement?
Well, I think a lot of this is still unfolding, and a lot of the construction industry is still figuring out how to navigate this new reality. I felt that it was a mistake for the governor to shut down residential construction by and large. I thought that was, not only, harming the projects, harming the livelihoods of people involved in them, harming the revenue that comes off of that to the state and local governments. But I'm glad that he showed some flexibility in the most recent iteration of the stay healthy order. But this will be something that the construction industry has to navigate carefully, and I hope that we're able to move as quickly as possible in a way that is also responsible and safe to open more and more, because our economy depends on it, and frankly, just as importantly, if there is a second wave of COVID-19, say in the fall, we've got to be prepared as a state to deal with that in a way that does not involve shutting down our economy. We can't use economic shutdown sort of as an ongoing way of operating. That's not going to work for our society. So one of the things the legislature has a role in, even though our role is quite limited under the emergency powers statute, one of the roles that the legislature is going to have is to plan ahead for what comes next. And we may have an opportunity to do that in a special session, both to mitigate and to manage the budget impacts coming out of this time period, but also as we reprioritize to think, okay, how can we be prepared for the next wave or some other future emergency that is going to be challenging to the people of our state. So we've got to be prepared, better prepared than we were certainly this time, and do it in a way that doesn't require us shutting down the economy.
And I guess obviously the shutdown's been going on for a while now. I've been working from home remotely for a couple of months. Do you see a sort of, and day by day, right, the data is going to be changing, but do you see any sort of time frame for the gradual lifting of the COVID-19 restrictions that we're currently under?
Well, the governor certainly has given some benchmarks and some timeframes, but a lot of the people who contact me talk about how they'd like more certainty. They would like a faster timeline on that. I think one of the things I would point people to look at is an alternative plan for reopening our economy that House and Senate Republicans in our state have put forward that I think is responsible. It accommodates the public health kinds of concerns that are out there, but also moves us toward a faster reopening of sectors of our economy where that's appropriate. And so that's available on the House and Senate Republican websites.
Thank you. And Senator, we have a very engaged audience of young professionals, and there are a couple of questions for you from them. The first question is this. It can be difficult to regularly contact our legislators to voice opinion for or against a bill, given the sheer number of bills. What suggestions do you have for young professionals to make their voices heard without succumbing to advocacy fatigue and feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah, I would say, get to know your local legislators on a first name basis. And, it's not just the periodic email to your legislator, but get to know them personally. And whether that's sitting down for coffee, whether that is going to visit them in their office during the legislative session. So I think just having that regular, sustained kind of relationship building. And, as you have opportunities to get involved in your community, there'll be repeated interactions with your legislators. And so just look for that kind of repetition as you get engaged.
All right. Thank you. And then the second question from our audience is the following. If our state senator or representatives do not share the same views as we do, it can feel like our concerns fall on deaf ears. Is it effective to call or write to members of a committee a bill is being heard in, even if they are not representatives of our district?
I would say, by and large, communicate with your own legislators. Those are the folks. I've got 150,000 constituents. Those are the folks I work for, and they're my bosses, and that can be challenging sometimes because I've got probably as many Democrats as Republicans, and a lot of independents as well. And sometimes, one set of constituents wants me to do one thing, and another set wants me to do another thing. But I'm hired to basically make those tough choices. As far as legislators outside of your district, I think where you can most have some kind of influence on folks is within the political party. And that's, the way I explain the legislative process is that there are basically three criteria that legislators use when they're making decisions. And the three criteria are their constituents, their district, their party, and their conscience. You never go against conscience, but I would say most issues in the legislature are not conscience issues that are sort of this tug between right and wrong. Most issues are what I would call prudential issues, where you're trying to figure out the best path forward given the limited information you have and kind of the totality of circumstances as you see them at that time. And so hopefully most of the time, those three factors I mentioned, your party, your district, and your conscience line up. But there may be times where you have to choose your district over your party or something like that. But the party is definitely, it factors in significantly to the decisions that are made. And so that is one way to voice an opinion, is by being involved in the political party structure. And that has an influence on the decisions that are made in Olympia and the kinds of positions that legislators take as they influence policy.
Thank you. And we have a few signature questions that we ask of all our guests, and we want to get your responses on. What will this issue, in this case, the housing bills from the latest legislative session, mean for young professionals in the state of Washington?
Well, for young professionals, so many of the professions touch on the housing sector of our economy. Whether it's construction, whether it is the rental industry, whether it is, just so many other industries that feed into housing. And So I would say being involved in housing policy is critical. And I think right now, more than ever in the time that I have been watching legislative action, legislators are receptive to good ideas about housing, and there is some bipartisan interest in this. And so I would say this is a really good time to be sharing ideas, generating ideas, discussing these things. And, if you've got a good idea about housing policy, share that with a legislator. There are other areas of policy where it's pretty predictable kind of what the set of ideas are going to be that are on the table. But housing, I think there's a lot of room for very fresh thinking.
And then, obviously, you mentioned, talking with your legislator. In addition to that, do you have any suggestions about how I and other young professionals can get involved or engaged in housing issues?
I would say get involved in a trade organization or other, statewide association or local organization that is working on housing policy that is of interest to you. Pay attention to some of the emerging think tanks or centers that are out there looking at housing policy specifically. I mentioned Up for Growth earlier. They're an interesting one that is bringing some good ideas to the table and also pointing out a lot of the kind of just basic facts that people ought to be aware of. I mentioned the 225,000 housing units short, and I think a lot of legislators are aware of that statistic because of what Up for Growth is doing.
Thank you. And then our last signature question, what will the impact be on the free markets in our state?
Well, we've got to maintain, a free market when it comes to housing. And frankly, when it comes to our economy, I think there's a lot of pressures right now that would lead us away from markets and toward, stronger government or government centralization. And we have to guard against that. We have to preserve the role of small businesses, particularly, I think, in this time. I worry about, the future of small businesses in my own community. I hear from small business owners right now who are very scared. Some of them are facing potentially shutting down for good. And that's concerning. And so we've got to figure out ways coming out of this as soon as possible to provide the right incentives for small businesses to keep going. We depend on small business for our economy. And certainly big business has a big role too. And Washington State is blessed to have some really great big businesses. But the free market is just essential, and it is the lifeblood of what makes Washington great. One of the real defining things about what makes our country great.
Well, Senator Zeiger, it's been a pleasure talking with you. Thank you very much for joining with me today.
Thank you, Michael.
And then to our listeners, if you're between 18 and 40 years of age and passionate about making a positive difference on policy issues, check us out online at washingtonpolicy.org/youngprofessionals.
Thanks for listening to Washington Policy on the Go. If you liked it, tell a friend and share this episode on your social media. Send any questions or comments to us at washingtonpolicy@washingtonpolicy.org.